Anxiety's at an all-time high, but does it always mean something's wrong?
In this episode of the Enriched Mindset Podcast, we sit down with Dr. Karen Rowa, renowned clinical psychologist and lead of the Anxiety Treatment and Research Clinic at St. Joseph's Healthcare.
She's here to challenge what you think you knew about anxiety. Why do we feel anxious even when life seems fine?
Why do common coping strategies backfire?
And what if anxiety isn't the enemy, but a message worth decoding?
So our anxiety is actually really functional. As being a human being and having anxiety and stress is a normal part of experience and kind of an important part of our experience.
Dr. Rowa breaks down the science, the myths, and the tools that actually help.
She also shares insights from her work with OCD, her appearance on Hoarders, and her behind-the-scenes role as a consultant on Canada's Got Talent, offering tips for those who struggle with stage fright or performance anxiety.
If you've ever felt trapped by anxiety, this conversation will challenge everything you thought you knew. I'm Dr. Lee.
And I'm Emilia.
And welcome to the Enriched Mindset Podcast. Today we have Dr. Karen Rowa. How are you doing today, Karen?
I'm doing really well, thank you.
Tell us about your day. How was your day today?
My day was great. It's a Friday.
Yeah?
It's beautiful weather here in Hamilton. Had a really productive work day, so it's great.
It's such a pleasure to have you on our podcast. We have a bit of a tradition on these podcasts. We start with some psychology dad jokes.
Excellent.
Yeah, so you ready?
Gosh, so good.
A couple riddles here. Okay. Emilia, maybe you can start.
So why did the anxious tomato refuse to cross the road?
Why?
Because it couldn't catch up with its intrusive thoughts.
Okay. All right. Why did the anxious pencil have trouble relaxing?
Why?
No guesses? Because it couldn't stop drawing conclusions. Okay. All right. Well, Karen, sometimes students find professors a bit intimidating and it's hard for them to feel like they're actually human beings. Is there something interesting about you that students might not know?
Oh, I mean, how much time do we have? Yeah, well, today on my way over driving from my office over to campus, I was listening to one of my favorite things, which is a Formula One podcast, because the Formula One season for 2025 has begun, and I am a diehard Formula One fan. I watch every race with my husband every weekend, so.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. What's your favorite team?
Oh, well, I'm actually open this year because my very favorite driver retired last year. Okay. So I'm just really in for the spectacle. I'm a little bit rooting for McLaren this year. I think that would be great. I'm sort of not biased anymore now that my very favorite driver has taken his retirement.
Oh, awesome. Well, you're full of surprises.
Yeah.
So did your husband get you into that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
A really interesting thing for our audience, I went to graduate school with Karen at the University of Waterloo, and we shared an office together.
We sure did.
One thing I remember is you told me this really interesting thing that you would listen to Howard Stern on the way to school, and I was shocked.
John, I have a full, massive subscription that I just renewed to Sirius Satellite Radio to get my Howard Stern interviews still. It's another one of my diehard. Love it. He gives a great interview. He gets into the psychology. You know, we think of Howard Stern as being offensive, and he's had his moments of that. Yeah. But he is an incredibly good interviewer. He gets underneath people's skin. He asks all these deep, interesting questions. So as a psychologist, I love it.
Awesome. Emilia, do you know who Howard Stern is?
I know him as Howie from America's Got Talent. Yes.
Yeah.
You got it. Yeah.
And we're going to touch on that because Karen's a consultant with Canada's Got Talent, which is really cool and interesting. So let's get started with some of these questions we have.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dr. Rowa, you wear so many hats: researcher, clinician, professor, leader. How did this all start? Like, what was your initial passion? Why did you choose psychology?
Yeah, that goes way, way back. In high school, I wanted to be an accountant.
Oh, really? Wow. No way.
Which I know John knows me well, so he knows that's not my personality. Yeah, my dad was an accountant, and I liked math. So, it's one of those sort of natural things. You think, oh, maybe that's the right career for me. Then at some point, I realized that I liked people too much. So I wanted to do something where I could be actively engaging with people on a very regular basis. And through some personal family circumstances, I actually had exposure to a close family member seeking treatment from a psychologist who I thought was just incredible. The work that person did, their kindness and empathy, how much they helped my loved one. And that was it. I was sold. I thought, that's what I'm going to study. That's perfect for me.
That's
amazing.
wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you study anxiety, OCD, perfectionism. A lot of times psychologists have some kind of personal connection to the things that they study. Was that the case for you at all?
Only through my family member who had really struggled with some mental health difficulties.
Okay.
That was the inroad. The rest of it was just an absolute falling in love with everything that I could learn about psychology and finding my passion. I actually started out focusing in my master's thesis. I did my master's degree out at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, which is where I'm from. And I was studying eating disorders, so family factors with eating disorders. It was really, really interesting area. I was really quite fortunate. And then I needed to do a practicum. And for personal reasons, I wanted to come out west to Ontario to do the practicum. And I called around to a bunch of places. And the first person that called me back was the head of the anxiety clinic at CAMH in Toronto. I went there for a placement and fell deeply in love with OCD and anxiety disorders. And I think going back to the idea of a personal connection, one of the things I love about anxiety disorders is that everybody can relate. We all have anxiety. We have anxiety that's small. We have anxiety that's large. We have anxiety that's situational. But like, it's such a relatable experience. And I felt like with eating disorders, I thought I have such deep empathy, but I didn't have the personal experience or that personal connection in the same way. And I thought, I could probably hopefully do some good work here, but I thought I can do really good work in anxiety and really feel it as well.
Amazing. Do you have any highlights of your journey to becoming a professor, a clinical psychologist, and were there any real challenges, real lows during that process?
I would not say any deep lows. I've had a very, very fortunate experience with a lot of great opportunities. There's been some interesting circumstantial things that have happened that have given me opportunities that I never would have guessed. And one of them being having met my now husband when he was a graduate student in psychology and I was an undergrad at the University of British Columbia. And we promptly met and then he said, I'm leaving and I'm not coming back because he was off to do his career and he'd already committed to doing a residency in Toronto and he was going to probably settle elsewhere. So I had to make a decision about, do I stay or do I follow him and make my life what I can? So I actually had to take a leave of absence from my graduate program and then reapply. And John, you remember what the application process is like. It was terrifying. I thought I won the lottery the first time. How on earth is this going to go the second time? But I guess I'm someone who won the lottery twice. So that was really lucky. And so I got my opportunity to continue my PhD at the University of Waterloo and never looked back. It was such a great opportunity. So I would say that's lucky. When I mentor and talk to students now, it is never that lucky. It's gotten even more competitive now. The things I think about that were lacking in my application the first time that I'm always suggesting and mentoring for undergraduates now to think about, I wouldn't get in now. I'd have to spend a full extra year getting the experiences that I was lacking. So it was just really, really good luck. I know I had a lot of potential and somebody saw that and I really appreciate that they let me have a chance. And I tried to work my butt off to make the most of every opportunity that I've been given.
Yeah. What would you say that you were lacking, I guess, looking back? What's your advice for people who are applying to clinical psychology programs?
Yeah, I give people the advice that I didn't know at the time, which is I had focused on two things, and these are both important, but I was missing a massive third. I'd focused on getting the best grades I could, so keeping my studies up and having a good transcript. And then I focused on volunteering in meaningful clinical and mental health areas. So I'd done a ton of work for a Vancouver-based eating disorders organization, working with their speakers bureau. We used to go out and do educational events. I would drive all over the city and talk about eating disorders to high school students. I manned a phone line. It was a coaching information line. I did that for several years. So I had a ton of experience that way. And I bet you both can guess what I'm not talking about, which is my research. I had not taken a pathway to set myself up to do a formal honors thesis.
Oh, really?
And at UBC, they had a really convoluted program at the time, and you had to really make that decision early on. And I was missing prerequisites. And I hadn't been volunteering in any research labs. And in a very, very fortuitous turn of events, one of my fourth-year clinical psychology seminar profs very kindly called me up after class one day, and he said, are you wanting to go to grad school? And I said, absolutely, that's my goal. And he said, have you done any research? And I said, no, but here's all the other things I've done. And he said, you need to come to my lab and you need to start now. So he gave me this incredible opportunity to do the equivalent of a thesis, which is what helped me fill in that massive gap and give me this opportunity to actually be competitive when I went and applied to graduate programs. So that's the big one. It's the hands-on research experience. So a lot of the students I talk to very understandably focus on the clinical part of clinical psychology, which is really important. But when you're doing a PhD, the biggest thing you're doing is you have to do a full dissertation, which is a ton of research.
Yeah.
And so you need to be prepared for that. You need to have those kinds of experiences. That was my naivete. And luckily, once again, somebody gave me this great opportunity. And I'm forever grateful and indebted for them opening up their lab and letting me come in and do some work.
That's amazing.
Amazing. I think that's a really common theme where people you run into people that somehow reach out to you or just see something in you. And I think it's so important to maintain those kinds of connections. You never know what opportunities lie ahead of you.
Yeah.
We have a mutual colleague, David Moskovich. Yeah. He was telling us that none of his grad students went straight from BA. And most of them took 2 years to actually publish research. So I'd only done my honors thesis, which I did well on, but it wasn't published or anything. So I agree with you. I don't think I could get in right now. I'd have to spend a couple of years, but...
Absolutely.
Is it possible for people going straight from BA now, do you think?
You know, it still happens. It's the exception, not the rule.
Okay.
So in our graduate program here at McMaster, everybody coming in has a master's degree already in something else.
Wow.
But I do have, for example, one of my honors thesis students from last year is in a graduate program at York University in clinical developmental psychology, straight from undergrad.
Wow.
Okay.
This year, I have another thesis student who just also got accepted to the same program, York Clinical Developmental. Maybe there's a theme here. That's a great program. It's a wonderful program. I think it's just a coincidence. But she also got an offer this year straight out of undergrad. But that is very rare. Most of my former thesis students have had to go on and do 1 to 2 years of research assistant work or taken a master's degree in something else like neuroscience or something that just gives them even more kind of hands-on research experience.
Okay. Right. We want to talk a bit more about anxiety.
Sure.
I get this question asked a lot as a clinical psychologist, but do you ever experience anxiety yourself? And can you tell us about what that's like?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, as a human being, I do. Yes, I still get anxious at the beginning of every time I do a new group therapy at the hospital because it's important to me. And I want to do well, and I want to make sure that I'm engaging people and starting off on the right foot and making people feel really welcome. So I always get a little bit of anxiety that pumps me up before I have to do any kind of a talk or a presentation somewhere. So still get that. I have 2 kids, so 16 and 20. When my 20-year-old first learned to drive, for a little while I couldn't go to bed because, you worry about, like, are they okay? So it took me a little bit of time to move through that anxiety and realize, yep, perfectly capable, she's doing well. So, yeah, I could keep going on, but absolutely, it comes up in all sorts of circumstances.
Yeah. What are, your best tips to manage anxiety, manage stress?
Yeah, I kind of go back and forth between what I tell myself and then what I would also do in therapy. So one of the things that I find can be really helpful is some of the simple stuff, like don't forget to breathe. So it's so silly and simple, but when I'm really stressed out or really overwhelmed, I will take a very big head-to-toe sigh. And just reset myself. Because I notice I'm getting into some chest breathing and I'm getting a little tense and I'm speaking quickly and not taking good breaths. So I have to reset myself. So I think that's probably something that all of us can benefit from. And then a lot of stuff around perspective. So we do a lot of work in the therapy that I do on challenging when our thoughts get really unhelpful or catastrophic. And I think those kinds of skills are helpful for all of us. So what's the worst thing that's going to happen here?
You're right.
How did this go last time? So thinking about my kid out learning how to drive and then she's off. And you can imagine the first thing that come to a parent's mind might be, oh my God, she's had a crash or she's been distracted while driving or all of her friends are playing music loudly and she's going to get into an accident or something. And then you have to talk back to that and say, or not. Or maybe she's really listened. When you said, put your phone away, you're not allowed to have your phone anywhere near you when you're driving because you don't want to be distracted. And what's the chance of something catastrophic happening? And the likelihood isn't zero, but the likelihood is really low. And the more evidence you gather, so you keep going along, then the data just gets more and more robust. And then it's sort of hard to refute that, well, nothing bad has happened. So it could happen, but it's not the most likely thing. So I like perspective a lot. My big one that I love, and this isn't CBT, this is more of a dialectical behavior therapy idea, but it's the concept of radical acceptance. So when things happen, instead of fighting them or being mad about them, working towards leaning in and saying, that's exactly what it is. It's going to go that way. This is the way life is. And that doesn't mean that we like it or agree with it. It just means that we accept it so that it frees up all sorts of other resources to then think, well, what do I want to do about it? How do I want to cope? How do I want to manage something that's really difficult that I can't make not happen?
Right.
So I like those ones a lot for myself.
Yeah. One interesting thing is there's different terminology. There's anxiety, there's stress, there's panic, worry. Do these definitions matter? How important are they for people to understand?
It depends on the context. In some contexts, not at all. They're just other alternative descriptors for a physical, cognitive, and emotional experience, and they all work really well. For what I do, it does matter because I am looking for a very specific set of symptoms, because we do a lot of treatments that are focused on the type of anxiety. There's many different types of anxiety disorders. There's lots of ways anxiety shows up for people. So if I want to focus the treatment as best I can and get as specific as I can, then it matters for me, because there's a big difference between maybe not a huge difference, but for me there's a big difference in terms of how I treat someone who's having unexpected panic attacks versus somebody who's having panic attacks because they worry a lot about their health or about school or about their relationships. I'm going to approach that quite differently. So for me, it matters a lot, but I think for most of us, it doesn't. It really helps us kind of come back to, we get when somebody says I'm really worried and feeling anxious and stressed about something, that means something to most of us, and it's good communication.
Yeah. I actually don't think we defined anxiety yet. Would you be able to define it for us?
Yeah, so it's got multiple components. So physical, cognitive, and emotional or behavioral as well aspects of thinking about future negative things. So concerns about bad things that could happen. So anxiety is the close cousin to fear. Fear is this intense reaction that something really bad is happening. And anxiety is the future-oriented, slightly less intense version of that can linger on and on about something that might go wrong or might happen or might be scary.
I often hear young people talk about my anxiety, almost like they're embracing it as part of their identity. Can you comment on what you're observing among Gen Z with respect to anxiety? Is it different? Are there any concerns you have on how they're framing it in their minds?
What I've experienced and noticed is that young people have mental health literacy that far exceeds other generations, Gen Z, but also millennials. They have better terminology. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'll out myself on that one. They just have more language for it. They think about it. I remember once one of my kids came up to me and said, all of my friends have therapists. Do I need a therapist? And I said, well, do you have symptoms that you're worried about? She said, no. I'm like, well, keep going then. But yeah, I was really impressed. I'm like, wow, these are kids who are asking for help. So that's kind of amazing. Gen X might ignore those symptoms and think, oh, that's just what I have to suffer with. The one thing that I think is really important that we always want to emphasize is that anxiety is a normal, common, prevalent human experience. And even with all the therapy in the world, you don't want to get rid of your anxiety. Your anxiety is useful. It serves a function. You know, the idea of low to moderate anxiety, it propels us and motivates us to prepare and be ready. And if I'm crossing the street and I don't have anxiety when I hear somebody honking because there's a car coming, well, what's going to tell me to respond? So our anxiety is actually really functional. And so what I would really just want to emphasize is how important it is that we need it, and that a lot of it's not pathological. So we don't want people to over-pathologize. Like, being a human being and having anxiety and stress is a normal part of experience and kind of an important part of our experience. And learning to manage that's important and wonderful. But it really has to cross quite a significant threshold before we're going to call it an anxiety disorder or really think, oh gosh, that person might need medication or therapy or both to help them manage.
Right. A lot of our audience are psychology majors, young people, and they reach out to us through social media. Can you comment on the impact social media has on anxiety. We always hear of it as a negative. Are there any positives?
Well, there's more negatives than positives.
Yeah, okay.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's probably all the things that you've heard from others and that you've observed yourself, the unrealistic expectations that social media puts out, which is really hard for people who are grappling with their own anxiety and trying to think about what their future and what's going to happen and how they're managing. So that's really problematic. And then I think there's value about good information being readily accessible and talking about ways to manage anxiety and when to seek help, etc. The problem is that it's interspersed with a lot of non-scientific, non-evidence-based information that may be either just a person's experience, which is important, but not necessarily what's going to work for everybody, all the way over to problematic advice that you would worry that somebody might get about their mental health symptoms. So it's got a lot of great potential. It's just not as well vetted, I would say, as what we might like in terms of sharing information broadly.
Right. A lot of students felt that the most anxiety-inducing event was like test taking, exams, assessments. Do you have any advice for students who struggle with stress and anxiety around exam season?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of things that are important. And one of them is to think about managing physical anxiety. And there's a short game and a long game in that one, right? Because the long game is, do you eat well? Do you sleep enough? Do you manage your caffeine level? You know, all these things are really not good for our stress and anxiety levels in the long run. So the long game is, are people really thinking about those things and managing them as best they can? And then the short game of managing our physical anxiety symptoms are all sorts of things around breathing exercises. There's a lot of guided imagery, things that you can get that just kind of bring you back to the moment. Some people really do well with grounding exercises, where if you're in your head and getting ahead of yourself and starting to panic about the exam, just bringing yourself back to the present moment. What's happening around me? What's physically around me? What can I see? What can I hear? Like coming back to the moment. So there's physical anxiety management, things that are really helpful and important. And then there's also management of the catastrophic thoughts and predictions and worries. So I was actually out with a friend recently. We would go for a big hike every weekend. And her daughter, who's away at university, called and was thinking about all the 5 million things that she had to do and all the papers she had to write and all these things. And she's a smart kid who's doing really well. And I leaned over to the phone and I said, "You want my best advice?" And she said, "Yes, I do." I said, "It all doesn't matter because you're going to do fine. You're doing well. What you get on this particular test is not going to make or break your life, your career, your opportunities. Do your best. Go for it. Be prepared. But keep in the mind this sort of perspective and mindset, and this is my idea of decatastrophizing, that it isn't as big as it feels.
Yeah.
So try to find a way of thinking about that and keeping that perspective as close by. Easier said than done, but these are the kinds of things that we want to encourage people to be thinking about.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting because I've heard people even say, all these people you're worrying about, we're all going to die anyway. And in a couple of generations, people are not even going to know who you are.
Right.
And it kind of short circuits all this catastrophic thinking and just gets people to be more bold. But are you familiar with kind of these new therapies like ketamine, psychedelics, or even like things like AI? What's your comment on these new therapies? Because we're finding sometimes that things that are evidence-based like CBT sometimes feel like they're getting out of vogue or out of fashion.
Right.
What are you seeing as an anxiety researcher and practitioner?
Yeah. So I will say I don't know a ton about psychedelics and ketamine because that is so far outside of my area of expertise. Right. But I certainly know a little bit about some of the research on, for example, psychedelics for therapist-assisted psychedelic use for PTSD, ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. One of the areas that I work a lot in is obsessive-compulsive disorder. And at its mild to moderate levels, it's all CBT, like all therapy, some medications, or a combination of the two. And that's really where I hope people would go. And I really think we need to put our emphasis there. But very severe OCD, that's where people have tried and tried and tried, you need to get creative. And there's a lot of steps beyond therapy and medication, including different levels of augmenting medication, so working with a psychiatrist to find combinations of medications that might be more helpful. But then moving beyond that to some neurostimulation. So things like a transcranial direct stimulation, which is a very safe, gentle stimulation that people can get in combination with therapy. There's a little emerging evidence on that, all the way up to brain surgeries for OCD. And so I feel that really affects my person because I've worked with a number of clients with OCD whose lives have been completely impacted and impaired by their symptoms and have had to go to the point of having brain surgery. So I'm really open to innovation when it's done properly with scientific backing. And so I'm really excited and I welcome studies on things like ketamine if there is a role for it to help these very serious conditions where people have tried all the sort of first and second line interventions and have really not gotten the benefit that we would like them to get. I feel encouraged when there's a next step. I will defer to my very talented research colleagues who are experts in neuroscience and psychiatry and neurology, make sure that there isn't a body of evidence to support that. But yeah, I would say that I'm in the camp of firmly open. Show me the data and the science so that people aren't taking ketamine in an unlicensed, unregistered setting where there's no guidance, there's no therapist or medical practitioner
or a nurse,
there. That's essential. I think my understanding of ketamine treatments, you need a nurse or a medical practitioner and a therapist there for that to have any chance of being effective and safe. And so I just want to make sure that people, if they ever got to that point, that they'd tried everything that's available and it's done properly.
Yeah, so you've had an insane research career. You've published over 50 peer-reviewed articles. What has been the most interesting finding or the work that you have done that has resonated the most with you?
I really have tried to have a body of research that is super clinically relevant. My goal is that anything I do research-wise will help me the next day when I'm working with clients. I want this to be directly translatable. My research is not like developing a brand new therapy that's going to change the world. It's modifications, little modifications to our therapies, little modifications to our models of understanding that give us clues about how to better help people. So I would say a good example, and I actually brought up a close friend and colleague, Dr. David Moskovich, earlier, and he and I worked together. He's a social anxiety expert, and certainly I do a lot of work in that area, but he's the expert. So we collaborated to do some really neat studies. In one of our studies, we were looking at the impact of safety behaviors in social anxiety. So safety behaviors are any kind of behavior people engage in to try and feel safer, less anxious, more able to cope in a situation. So in social anxiety, it would be examples like avoiding eye contact to feel more safe in their bubble, or over-rehearsing a conversation to make sure that they say the right thing instead of reacting to what the person is saying to them. And what we were interested in, we looked at people with social anxiety, and then we had a comparison sample of people who didn't have significant anxiety or other mental health difficulties. And we asked them to do a videotaped speech, and then we looked at their performance as rated by objective people who were coding their performance. And not surprisingly, the individuals with social anxiety didn't perform as well. But we weren't satisfied with that because we both had worked with so many people with social anxiety. We're like, they're very skilled people. There's got to be something else. So what we wanted to do is to look at the role or the impact that their use of safety behaviors had on their performance. And once we looked at that and entered it into our sort of statistical model, it wiped out the impairment. So to me, that was really important and interesting. And then I followed up on another study where we looked at a similar idea, except we did a conversation research task where people with social anxiety had a conversation with somebody new, kind of a get-to-know-you semi-structured conversation, so lots of chatting back and forth and sharing things. And then we looked at the impact of their use of safety behaviors on not only how anxious they felt and how other people rated their performance, but also how authentic they felt in the moment.
Yeah.
And what we found is, again, it was the safety behavior use that impacts those important variables. And so for me, that's really not only interesting, but also really relevant. So the first thing that I'm doing when I meet with someone with social anxiety is I'm thinking, how are we going to get you to be aware of and then reduce and drop your safety behaviors? Because then your performance might be perfect. Like, it might be amazing. You might have no social deficits. Now, some people with social anxiety are a little rusty in their skills because they've been a bit avoidant. And so maybe they do need a little practice, but the vast majority of people with social anxiety are perfectly socially skilled. It's their safety behaviors that are making things awkward for them. So to me, I love that kind of work because it's so directly applicable. I tell my clients about it. We do experiments where they drop their safety behaviors and focus on how authentic they feel. If it's a conversation that they're doing in therapy, the other person rates how much they want to talk to them again. And we consistently find the same thing, which is that you drop your safety behaviors, you feel more authentic, and the person is interested in talking to you again.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
So at Enriched Mindset, we have a team of 15 psychology students, and they were super excited to know that you were going to be on the podcast. So we have a few questions from them.
Awesome.
Hi, Dr. Rowa. I'm Michaela Santos, a second-year psychology student at the University of Toronto. I know that you're a consultant for Canada's Got Talent, and I actually used to do some singing competitions and some performances when I was younger. But leading up to every competition and performance, I was really anxious and nervous. What advice do you have to some people who experience stage fright or get nervous with public speaking and performing?
So maybe first we can talk about Canada's Got Talent, just briefly. Can you talk to us about how that came about?
Yeah, it was just like many of my great experiences, it was an opportunity that arose. So one of my very good friends and colleagues got reached out to by another colleague who happened to just have some connections in that industry. And they were looking for an anxiety or stress expert to go and be on set just in case people needed a little bit of mental health support. So she said, "Want to go do it?" And I said, "Sure, let's go." Sounds interesting. So I was game. I like a new experience, and I thought that sounded like a pretty interesting thing to try.
You must have people like Michaela who are really anxious when they get on stage. Do you have any just general advice for people in that situation?
Practice, 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 and then practice some more. Our best and most helpful technique for an anxiety disorder is actually exposure therapy, where we expose ourselves to the very things we've been avoiding and feel anxious about in very particular ways. So we have lots of guidelines about how to do it so that it's really helpful, because exposing ourselves to things that are hard, that's hard. So you want to make sure you're doing it in a way where we actually have people learning something about their ability to cope, practicing something like a speech or a talk. I should clarify, you don't want to do the same one so that you've memorized it. That actually takes away from the authenticity.
Right.
But you want to practice speaking in front of others in lots of different environments until it doesn't bother you quite as much. So you got to get up and find places. You can do it in front of friends, in front of your mirror. You can do it in front of family. You can do it in front of classes. You can volunteer to put your hand up at a meeting at work.
Right.
But you want to make sure that you're practicing. So somebody who's singing, they got to go and sing all over the place. People who show up, and there are some people who show up and they have never sang in front of others before, and then they get on a stage like Canada's Got Talent. So kudos to them. That is really impressive.
Yeah.
But most people have a little bit of stage fright, a little bit of anxiety. Public speaking is the number one fear in the general population, though everybody has a little bit of it. And the key is actually just practicing it so much that you learn you can do it, that you check out all your catastrophic predictions, make sure that you're not expecting that you're going to be perfect at it, because nobody is, and that your body gets used to it too, because there's something about doing something again and again and again, our bodies kind of dull out. I always tell my clients, if you watch a scary movie once, you're going to jump. If you sat and watched it 20 times over, you're going to get bored. Let's do that with other things, right? Yeah. So if I'm scared of public speaking and I speak once or twice at a work event or a conference, I'm going to be really scared both times.
Yeah.
So if I really want to master that, if it's important to me, if it's coming up a lot, if it's something I need for my job or my career, I got to get out there and find a way to do public speaking as close to daily as I possibly can.
Yeah.
You just got to go and get out there and do it until it feels a little bit more manageable.
We're taking mental notes for our conferences this summer, so that's amazing. Thank you.
I had a recent experience where it's so useful to be an anxiety therapist when life happens and anxiety and stress pop up. So I was giving like a brief talk to some people who work for Ontario Health in one of my provincial roles. And so it was brief. It was on Teams, and we use Teams a lot, but I've had a lot of technical hiccups. So I made sure to go 15 minutes ahead, and then 10 minutes into my talk, I was still not in the meeting. I had 3 people trying to help me, and they finally said, "Oh my gosh, can you call in?" So I did the talk into my phone without them being able to see me and somebody advancing my slides. And I had some stress in those moments because I'm like, shoot, this is important. I wanted to be there. I was, prepping early. And then the other part of me that believes in and leans deeply into radical acceptance just radically accepted. I'm not getting in. For whatever reason, there was a glitch in the system and it wouldn't let me in. And I thought, what's the worst that's going to happen? Yeah. Either I don't give the talk and somebody else does, or I do it into my phone. And that's exactly what happened. And it was all fine. So I think those are good examples of like, what are you going to do? This is life. And most people are incredibly forgiving and don't even probably think about it 20 minutes later, right?
Yeah. Okay, I have a video from one of our staff members, Nicole.
Hi, Dr. Rowa. My name is Nicole Quelhas, and I'm a third-year psychology student at Wilfrid Laurier University. I always feel like I have to double-check that I lock the door before I leave, even when I know I already did. Why does my brain do this, and when does it cross the line into something a bit more serious?
The double checking. So that's great. It's a really good question. One of my best friends from high school always went back and did a double check. And I don't think she has OCD. I think some of us do it. One of the things that I would say, and I think this is important, there's a body of research that comes out of Adam Radomski's lab in Concordia. He's an OCD expert. And it really talks to us about what might happen the more we check something. And we're checking things like checking the door to be more sure. And very ironically, the more we check things, the more we become unsure. Like we have what he calls increased memory distrust. So if I check it once, I might be a little bit unsure, but it's not that bad. Sometimes the more we check, and this is true for people without OCD, so all of us, the more we check something, if she went back and checked again and again and again, she would probably get more doubtful and more confused. And so that body of research really informs us when we're working with clients with OCD who check in a variety of ways for a lot of things and more than just twice. Our motto is the first check is the best. Yeah, it's never getting better than that. You might not feel fully sure, but that's okay. And then I usually follow up by saying, I am not sure about a lot of things, including whether my children are alive right now. And I can say that honestly now because I have no idea, but I'm pretty sure they are. Because I haven't received a panicked phone call. I haven't had somebody search me out. I haven't had my husband call me to say there's been a catastrophe. So I'm pretty sure, and that's got to be good enough. So we think about checking. If you're checking 2 times and you're not checking anymore and it isn't escalating and it's not seeping into other areas of life, no problem.
Right.
Absolutely no problem. I'm not worried about it. But for those people where it starts off as 1 or 2 times and then it morphs into 3 or 4, or it starts to be like not just the front door, but now I have to go back and check the stove and I have to unplug things and I have to check, that's when we're talking about, we're going down a road where the more we check, the more unsure and confused we're going to feel. So maybe it's good to stop that right away before it becomes a real problem. So some people with OCD, it becomes paralyzing. They have to check for hours and they never feel certain and they're just plagued by needing to attempt to get a sense of certainty that's never coming. Yeah.
I'm curious as to your perspective about the evolutionary side of OCD origins and anxiety origins.
Yeah, so I approach OCD less from an evolutionary, but certainly it's a neurobiological disorder. And there's robust research on certain circuitry in the brain that is overactive or hyperactive when people have OCD. And what's really cool is that even a psychological treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy, if you do a brain scan before CBT and then after, that neurocircuitry calms itself down through CBT, even if you're not doing anything biological, no meds, no nothing. Obviously, there's many ways to try and help people, and so sometimes medications helps with that, but sometimes it's just the CBT that kind of calms that circuit down. So we know that about 50% of our understanding of OCD is heritable. There's a constellation of genetics. We know that there's circuitry in the brain. And then we also have psychological factors that matter as well. So for me, I look at OCD as a combination of all those things. And then it also reminds me that there's a number of ways we can support people to try and treat that.
On Enriched Mindset, we're really interested in financial psychology, psychology of money. Just curious if you can give your commentary or perspective on salary ranges for psychologists or other mental health professionals. What can people kind of expect?
Yeah, so you can expect that it's going to vary province by province. The most lucrative provinces to be a psychologist in are actually Ontario and Manitoba.
Really?
Manitoba is a rock star province that's been working hard on this because they really wanted to entice and retain psychologists to work in their public healthcare system. They've been doing a lot of work recently in making sure that psychologists are well compensated. Ontario's done a great job as well. Depending on the institution, the range of salary might be $60-something an hour up to $90 an hour is typical in a public healthcare setting.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting because the Ontario Psychological Association set an hourly rate in 2013 of $225. There was all this pressure for them to increase it, and there was a lot of inaction, and finally they said you can just set your own rate, which was pretty frustrating. But I recently saw a posting on LinkedIn for a psychologist job at one of the major teaching hospitals in Toronto, and the rate was $55 to $74 per hour. And I'm just wondering if the best people are not gravitating towards hospitals anymore. They're going into private practice.
So that's a super interesting question. So when I was on the job market in end of 2006, at that time, it was so hard to get a hospital job.
Yeah.
That was where the competition was. It was brutal, and trying to fight for positions, there was few and far between. They were the coveted jobs. And then that happened and continued for a number of years. And then you're absolutely right that lately the pendulum has shifted a little bit where it's a little bit harder to recruit and retain psychologists in public healthcare. And I think it's something we need to be very aware of because getting really, really strong psychologists in all sectors is really important, including in the public sector, to be able to continue the work that people like I do and all of our team at St. Joe's, where we provide publicly funded mental health care service, but also we do research. We are in leadership roles. We have a psychologist who's the vice president of mental health at St. Joe's. So from a strategy and a system perspective, that's a really important role, and psychology really lends itself very nicely to those sorts of leadership positions. Our skill set does. So I think that we're needing to keep our eye on making sure that we are doing things to recruit people. And one of the things I think we want to keep in mind, the average person thinking, okay, well, there's a no-brainer, $250 an hour, $300 an hour, whatever the psychologist might set as their rate. But let's also remember that a psychologist in private practice has overhead. They have to buy all their own supplies. If they have a building, they have rent, and they have no pension and no benefits. So if we think about it that way, they may have office staff and admin staff. I mean, they're not pocketing $300 an hour. It'd be delightful if they were. And you know what? If they were, good for them, because psychologists are really well trained and have a very unique skill set that's really helpful. But in let's say a hospital-based or a public healthcare job, there's probably other things that you're getting that are not part of your salary. Pension benefits, et cetera. The other thing, too, that I always remember is that in public healthcare, if my client doesn't show up, I'm getting the same amount of money that I would have gotten whether they did, versus my colleagues in private practice. If the client doesn't show up, they don't get paid. They have to factor that into their planning. They have to make sure that they are keeping their rate high enough so that they can afford their overhead, their staff, their own pension that they have to create, their own benefits that they have to pay for themselves, and their no-shows or cancellations. I haven't delved deep enough to know how much that actually balances out, but I do think it's really important to consider in terms of recruiting really good people to public healthcare. And I do a lot of that. I will say that I'm very fortunate to work at a healthcare setting where we have done nothing but grow in terms of our psychology positions. We recruit successfully, and we have an exceptional team. So we have over 30 psychologists now who work at St. Joseph Healthcare. Yeah, it's amazing. Like some hospitals have a couple, and we have over 30, and they're in specialty clinics, and they have leadership roles, and they're doing amazing research, and they're holding massive research grants and training the future psychologists and supporting clinical students. So it's pretty great. I think we do have to work harder at it. And I do think in terms of recruiting to public healthcare or community-based settings, I'm in a sort of an enviable and luxurious position that we have a hospital system that values psychology, and we have a lot of exciting things that are going on. So I think we can recruit maybe a little more easily than a smaller hospital that you're pulling someone in and they're going to be a little bit on their own. trying to build the service on their own and having to factor in all the other financial pieces.
Yeah.
So we do need to keep our eye on it and make sure that we're getting a nice balance that go to all the different sectors.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's so important. My first job after I got my PhD or got licensed was at a hospital in Mississauga, and there was a lot of competition for the same resource. So I was in the psychology department, and I was in cancer care. So we had psychiatrists, social workers, spiritual care, nursing. We were all competing for the same funding. And the hospital actually terminated the entire psychology department and then opened up a few positions. So that's actually what kind of led me to private practice, was the kind of instability. But if there was a culture, like a healthy culture, it made a world of difference.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That's exactly what institutions and healthcare settings need to do, is to develop culture. And one of the things that we try to do, any of us who are in leadership roles in our hospital, is to educate and advocate for psychology. So what can a psychologist do that makes them worthwhile to have on your staff? And you have to really let people know the breadth of skill set that you can get, because there's a lot of professions that are really good clinically.
Yeah.
And cost less than a psychologist. And so it makes sense to me that if that's what you're looking for, a clinical skill set, you can go a lot of different directions. What I want people to know is that a psychologist might bring many other things to the table around, like, research in all different forms. So if you're not doing grant-funded scientific treatment outcome research, but quality improvement, program evaluation, looking at evaluating initiatives on services, like, that's bread and butter for psychology. That's what we've been trained to do. So a psychologist is worth their weight in gold for that way. They can bring on learners and students, and if they supervise one excellent learner, you can see twice as many people.
Right. One of the questions we ask all our guests is their thoughts on the relationship between money and happiness. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I sure do. Isn't there a sort of an adage that money, it's a positive correlation until a certain point, and then beyond that, it doesn't matter? I buy that fully. I see people a lot who are actually low SES, and I'll tell you, it matters. Like, some people are dispositionally happy, and that's wonderful, but life is much harder if you do not have basic income. I'm a massive proponent of the experimental universal basic income, right? Like, all human beings, I say this to patients all the time, every human being deserves an income, and I don't really care where it comes from, if it's a disability income, or if it's a job income, or if it's something else. All human beings need their own source of money, and that to me feels like it should be a human right. One of the things that you can see is if you're struggling financially and really having trouble making ends meet, your stress level is going to be higher, your anxiety is going to be higher, like, it's just going to be really hard. And so your happiness may be affected by that. But then at the other end, there's a definite cap.
Right.
If you have a nice upper middle class income and you can pay your rent or your mortgage and go on a holiday every year, that versus having 3 times as much as that probably makes almost no difference in happiness.
And you probably know many people with much means, and they're not happy people.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think what would be interesting to know is what you're up to these days, what's the research you're working on, and how people can find out more about your work.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got a bunch of really neat research that's going on right now. One of the things I'm really interested in lately is supporting family members of adults with OCD in terms of how they can support but not accommodate the OCD. So this is a concept that's really well known in the pediatric world, where we work with families and parents are integral to the treatment. In fact, they're the most important part of most psychological treatments for kids with anxiety or OCD. So you work with the parents about how do you support your child without participating in the OCD or feeding into the OCD inadvertently. And so for the last number of years, I've been working with one of my psychiatry colleagues, Dr. Noam Sereni, who's a pediatric OCD expert. So obviously we can tell where our mindset came from on this. And we thought this is such a shame that supporting families drops off as people become adults, because they're still accommodating. They're still, unfortunately, participating in the OCD rather than figuring out how to set limits on that and still support their loved one. So we've been doing a lot of research. We've done some pilot work, and we've developed a program that provides an intervention for family members so that they become really well educated about OCD and how we treat it. And then we look at their role in terms of supporting but not accommodating. So our pilot work is really exciting, and now we're planning our next steps. What are we going to do next? So we're still seeing family members, and certainly these are from our patients with OCD that we see at the clinic. So people can find out more by going to www.stjoes.ca/anxiety, which is our anxiety clinics page. We also have a big project that we're coming close to the end of the data collection phase. It's in partnership with Sunnybrook Hospital that has a specialty OCD clinic. And our two clinics came together and decided that we wanted to do some research that I think is going to be pretty important in our sequencing and understanding what first-line psychological treatments are good for OCD. Right now we have one. It's CBT with exposure and response prevention. There's a big push towards looking at mindfulness-based cognitive therapy as an intervention for people with OCD. We've done some work looking at it as an adjunct to CBT, and we found that it provided further benefit for clients when you give them a mindfulness-based intervention after they did their CBT work. But what we don't know as a field, and we want to know, is what about as a first-line intervention? And between the two clinics, we have some really neat pilot data that looks really promising that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy might actually be just as good a first-line intervention. And the reason why that's great is because it increases choice for patients. So exposure and response prevention for OCD is hard work.
Yeah.
It's a hard sell. There's a 25% refusal and dropout rate for clients who say, I don't think I can do that. So for the question we had earlier, if it was someone who checked their door an awful lot because they had intrusive doubts that they'd left it open and they had to go back over and over again, our work is going to be having them expose themselves to that doubt and not check. And it really works if we do it properly. But it's hard treatment. I understand why some people say, no, thank you, Dr. Rowa. I'm not really into that. So if our data supports the idea that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy can be just as effective as a first-line treatment, we now have a second first-line treatment for OCD, and we can increase choice for our patients so that if they're not interested in one or the other or not ready to do one or the other, there's another really good option for them. So I'm really excited about that. Stay tuned. In about a year is probably when we'll be at the stage of disseminating the results of that study. But we've been at it for a couple of years and hopefully going to collect data for the rest of 2025 and then start looking at it.
Awesome. Well, I'm hoping we can reconnect when you get that data.
Yeah.
We're so grateful that you came on the podcast, sharing all your wisdom. It's been an absolute inspiration to hear your journey and what you're doing right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Your energy and your vibe is just truly contagious. You're such a positive person, and it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, both of you.